sweet dreams are made of this.
This is a true story my grandmother experienced. Truth be told, during her life, before she and my mum moved out from their home village, she experienced quite a few strange things, and this is one of them. My grandmother lived in a small village and was working as a postwoman. Her job allowed her to meet and talk with old people who told her some spooky, supposedly true stories about the area or people living there. Being a postwoman also meant she had to travel quite a bit to deliver mail, as there were fields, forests, and some people lived further from the center of the village. During spring, summer, and autumn, when the roads were good, she used her bike, and when it was winter, or very muddy, she took her horse with a wagon. This happened in the winter or late autumn because she took her horse. As I mentioned, some people lived quite far away, so she had to cross a forest in order to deliver some mail. As she was going back, she took another route in that forest, and somehow she ended up going in circles. She recalled that old folks told her a story that once there was a mansion and it sank into the ground instantly during a wedding feast, and only the priest managed to escape. Everyone else went into the ground with the house. Supposedly, years passed and the forest took over the place, but somehow it remained sinister. My grandmother figured that it must be the same cursed place. She heard that whoever walks into its territory ends up going in circles. She spent a good half of the day trying to get out of it, but no matter where she turned, she ended up going in circles. Round and round she went, not being able to escape. Then, as she got tired, she gave up and spoke to her horse. She asked him to take her home and released the reins, thus giving her horse total control and freedom. That horse brought her home. Turns out she spent a good 5 to 8 hours in there because it was already nighttime when she returned. To this day, she can't explain what happened. That accident occurred after years of work, and she was born in that village, so she knew the place pretty good. So, I was a wildland firefighter back in the day in Arizona. I worked in a forest that was generally popular with a lot of recreation in the northern portion, but I worked on the southern portion of the forest that was really remote. It barely had any roads or campgrounds, so if you wanted to recreate there, you had to work for it. The fire crew I was on had 2 duty stations, one in a small town where the rest of the forest employees worked out of, and the other that was about 2.5 hours away, up a really windy, mountainous road. The remote duty station had an old Forest Service ranger station and a newer double-wide trailer that was recently put in. When I worked at this place, it had no cell reception. When my crew and I weren't working, we were playing horseshoes and watching movies. They did eventually add a cell phone booster, which, sadly, made people play on their phones, but I digress. So, for my creepy story, I want to keep it pretty simple. But my supervisor from that crew had experienced some weird things as well working up there. There was one night, he told me he was cowboy camping, sleeping outside with no tent, and kept getting a weird mucousy drop of liquid on his face. He kept looking around and even yelling, and no one was around him. He told me he wasn't below any trees, so he knew it wasn't tree sap. He never slept outside there ever again, which leads me to believe he was telling the truth. Now for my story. I've had other interesting experiences at that remote duty station, but this one was scary. It was the night of July 4th, and we weren't on a fire, so the crew was playing horseshoes and having a good time. Everyone went to bed pretty early because we were going to have a hike the next day. I had my own small room in the double-wide trailer, and my bed was situated next to a big window. I started dozing off, but felt awake still, and I hear one of my co-workers outside my window asking me to come outside. I was laying on my side facing the window, and I didn't look up, but I felt their presence by the window. It felt as though something tall was looming over me from outside. They kept beckoning me, and I said no. Pretty quickly their voice started changing to a deeper, raspier, angrier voice. They started cursing at me.
Get the hell outside.
I just froze. It was a sort of demonic voice. I lay frozen, not moving while they yelled at me. Eventually it stopped and I fell asleep. I woke up the next day and wanted to ask my coworker if he was standing outside my window, but I felt too weird. Perhaps this was a mild form of sleep paralysis, but still weird. So, I've got a few weird experiences from my grandparents' house here in rural Mississippi that I've never quite been able to explain. To start, I'd just like to say that I'm a very objective and logical person. No bragging, just my own personality that I recognize. If something happens, I generally never let my mind wander to crazy, far-fetched places. The first experience was when I was younger, probably 10 to 11. I was watching TV with my grandmother. I call her Mimi. I thought everything was normal until I turned to look at her. She was staring right through me, eyes both dilated and glazed over. I asked, "Mimi?" And she turned her head unnaturally quick, upward, and reached her hand up and said in a soft, slow voice, "It's so fluffy, soft, airy, touch it." And then slowly let her arm down and went right back to watching TV. Obviously, I was in shock and even whimpered a little because I just couldn't understand what just happened. She heard me and asked if I was okay, and I just kept asking her what she meant and why she just did that. But she was just as confused as I was and just tried to calm me down. She didn't remember any of it. She was young for her grandma at the time and never showed any signs of dementia or Alzheimer's since. Nothing at all since that day. She's always been sound of mind. The next story takes place a few years later. I was about 15 at the time with my brother, 17, and it was pretty late at night. Now, my grandparents' property is surrounded by woods on two sides. The left leading into a deep forest of evergreen, and the behind short and ending at a lake with other houses within throwing distance. I've grown up my whole life in these woods, seen many critters, and was never really scared of them. They were more of a place of comfort and aloneness I liked. But I digress. Back to the story. My brother and I were walking up that long driveway that ended at the road because we kept hearing noises, like moving branches by the tree line, and wanted to check it out. We both knew whatever is in the woods, be it raccoon, possum, coyote, whatever, that logically we could easily overpower and kill it. On our way back from investigating, I heard walking behind us, and I turned around to see. It was pretty dark, and the only thing we had for light was from my phone, which wasn't much. All I can see was two bright eyes staring back, maybe 3 or 4 feet from the ground. I don't know what it was particularly, but even now, thinking about it, just those eyes and its presence filled me with the most horrific dread imaginable. It's like all my blood turned to ice, and I couldn't stop shaking. It wasn't just basic instinctual fear, but absolute dread. I immediately grabbed my brother's arm and ran as fast as I could to the porch, which has a light that shines about 10 feet into the yard. Whatever this thing was followed us, and when I made it to the porch and turned around, it had stopped just outside of the light, just enough to see those eyes. The way it swayed almost made me vomit. I've never seen any animal sway like that and move its head so oddly. The thing was too large to be a rabid raccoon or coyote. My brother and I quickly got inside and turned off all the lights and hid, under our blankets. I went to Nebraska Nation Forest every long weekend with two friends who I'll call Haley and Todd. I have known them for years, and we would never hike alone because of the risks. So we became a group. Anyways, it was spring break last year when we went on a week-long backpacking trip. It was a 7-hour drive there. Being 14, I couldn't drive, but Haley was 16 and Todd 15. Haley drove us there, and we had a great time for the first few hours of the drive. But when we got closer to the forest, something felt off. I know it sounds cliche, but I had this feeling like I was going to be sick. I ignored it and thought I was just nervous. So Haley and Todd noticed that I was off. They asked me what was up, and when I told them something wasn't right, they laughed, thinking I was trying to scare them. A few hours later, and the feeling is still there, but we were at the trailhead. I got out, and everything was as it should be. We grabbed our packs, and off we went. I felt like I was at home in the trees, and the feeling was soon forgotten. We walked a little over 5 miles that day before we set up camp. We had a 2-person tent that Haley and I had brought, and then a hammock Todd had brought. After we set up camp, we ate, and then we were just sitting by the fire, talking. Todd began complaining about how he didn't want to sleep in his hammock. I didn't want to listen to him complaining and offered to switch places. He gladly accepted. So the night went on like usual, until around 2 a.m. when we all got tired and went to bed. Well, everyone but me. I have extremely bad insomnia, so I was just mending to the fire. Finally, I decided to get into the hammock and read. So I put out the fire, grabbed my headlamp, and got into the hammock. I noticed that something was off, but I couldn't place what it was. That's when it hit me. It was completely silent in the woods. No crickets, no animals, nothing. My skin started to crawl. Something was off. I turned off my headlamp and laid down and kept silent. I wanted to try and hear some type of animal and ease my worries. That's when I heard it. Something was dragging against the tent. I wasn't even 5 feet from the tent. It freaked me out, and I did something really stupid. I called out my friends' names. The noise stopped. I got no answer, but this feeling of dread was something I haven't felt before or since. That's when I felt it. Something poked at the hammock. It wasn't like a soft poke. It was like a jab. I was horrified. What the hell had just touched me, and where the hell was it? I was frozen. I also suffer from anxiety and felt the panic rising in me. I couldn't understand what was going on. That's when I made another mistake. I decided I wanted to see what had just jabbed me. All this happened within seconds. I reached up and clicked on my light. That's when I saw it. It was straight out of my nightmares. There was a creature, about 4 feet above me, staring at me, kind of hunched over. It was about 3 feet off the ground, so this thing was probably 7 to 8 feet tall. It looked like a dog, but it also didn't. It had the face of a wolf, but human in a way. The eyes looked red. Ears looked like clipped pit bull ears. Its mouth pulled back in a snarl, and a hand, claw, paw thing blocking its face. I was terrified. Its teeth were huge and sharp. The paws, if you could even call them that, had 5-finger type things with sharp long claws that looked like they could tear me apart. I stared at this thing for what felt like hours, but it was only probably 5 seconds. That's when I screamed bloody murder. As soon as I did that, this thing let out something between a scream and a howl. It was deep, and I could feel it. That's when I heard Todd yell, "What the hell was that?" I heard the tent opening, and that's when the creature and I finally broke eye contact. I yelled at Haley and Todd to help me. I looked back up and this thing was climbing the freaking tree. It was still staring at me. That's when I saw the back of it. It had a tail of a dog, greyish silver fur, and a black mane down its back and a hump. I I took this opportunity to scramble out of my hammock. We took off without grabbing anything. I had no shoes, nothing. We made it to the car, but the whole time back, I heard something in the trees. The next day, we had park rangers go get our things as we were freaked out. When they got there, everything was gone. Not even trash remained. It was as if we were never there. They accused us of lying. We had no idea what had happened. I had no idea what I saw or why it didn't just kill me. I haven't been back to the woods for a very long time, but still, every time I close my eyes, I see that thing, and hear its roar. The events described here took place in a small country in Northern Europe, sometime between 2008-2009, during the middle of summer. I was around 17 years old back then, and spent a better part of the summer helping my dad. He was a logger, and his workday, as well as mine, started very early in the morning. We would wake up just before 4 a.m. and have a quick breakfast with coffee, dress up, get our gear, and drive out to the forest, which was around 15 to 20 kilometers, 9 to 12 miles away. My family lived in a rather small town surrounded by crop fields and forestry near the country's border, and the aforementioned trip meant you would get far away from civilization. Poor, often disappearing cell signal, old overgrown roads, and absolutely no one who lives there. No one for you to meet on your way to the felling. That's what they call the territory where loggers cut trees. To get to it, we needed to park our 4x4 truck on the side of a narrow road, walk 2 kilometers through thick overgrowth, and then climb down a steep hill. The route to this particular felling did stand out though. On our way there, we would pass an old, long-abandoned house that got my attention the first time I made this trip with my father. Judging by the appearance of the house, it was built at least 80 years ago. Definitely before the Soviet occupation, which meant that it could have been nationalized, with the original owners being deported sometime after 1940. All of the windows were gone, as well as the window frames. The roof was also gone, but you could still make out the individual rooms because the walls and the floor of this house was still somewhat structurally sound. You could also make out a yard that was hidden beneath the overgrowth. On one of our trips, I noticed some posters and a magazine lying on the floor in one of the rooms. It was from around the 80s, so I figured that that's the last time somebody lived there. Anyway, it sure was unsettling to find this abandoned property in the middle of nowhere. But it was only after our 4th or 5th trip that I realized its probable importance. We got to the felling, worked for about 3 hours, and decided to take a lunch break. It was a clear sunny morning, nobody around. Me and my dad sat on one of the bigger trees we cut down previously and proceeded to chow down on our sandwiches, taking occasional sips of coffee we brought with us in a flask. Then it began. Suddenly we both heard a dog barking somewhere in the distance. This was already weird enough, since we never heard anything other than the usual forest ambience in our previous days there. What made this even stranger was the fact that the barking noise came from within the forest, the part we had yet to chop and saw our way into. Me and my dad both stopped eating, looked at each other, and without speaking agreed that we would keep listening, and turned our heads towards the forest from where the occasional bark was coming. I eventually said, "Must be a stray dog, or somebody indeed does live somewhere nearby." My dad nodded and said, "Yeah, probably." As we resumed our lunch, it became clear that the barking was nearing our position, and now it was accompanied by distinct human-like footsteps, breaking branches, shoving leaves, and so on. It unnerved me a bit, but I quickly realized that soon enough, somebody would definitely emerge from the forest. Probably someone else who was logging near us. Although it would not explain the dog, as taking your pet to the felling would be very unusual. The barking continued, and the footsteps got louder and closer, close enough that both the person and the dog should clearly be visible. The sound stopped around 30 meters from where we sat, then resumed. Me and my dad kept looking in that direction and seeing absolutely nothing. The footsteps and the barking continued. These sounds now came from a cleared out area where we should have been able to see anyone or anything that stood or moved around there. We looked at each other in complete bewilderment and didn't speak. I could even hear the dog panting and sniffing around, with an occasional step being taken by apparently nobody. Around 40 seconds later, the sounds indicated that this, whatever it was moving away from us. Not back where it came from, but to the left. Soon enough, the sounds got very faint and disappeared. Me and my dad exchanged a few quick theories, but it was clear that neither of us understood what we had just experienced. We resumed work and left this place around the time we usually do, 11 a.m. or so in summer, when it's too hot to go on. And as I passed the house described earlier, I got chills, thinking that maybe what we witnessed is somehow connected to this abandoned property. I should state that we were both well rested that day and used to this type of work. This took place before I started using alcohol, and my dad has been a non-drinker all of his life. I should also mention that neither of us is a skeptic. I have an open mind, and these types of things do interest me enough to search information and read up on it. But we certainly don't spend much time talking about this stuff. I'm sorry for the long read and no monsters or angry ghosts. I'm a journalist by training and profession, so I did my best to describe things in a detailed and engaging manner. The story is not among the scariest ones, but it is absolutely true. I'm 17. I like to collect dolls, specifically with vintage looks or dates on them. Some I bought at a peddler's in Kentucky or a vintage closing sale in Michigan. One I actually bought on Etsy, the previous owner listing the item as haunted with a backstory. I have named all the dolls, and I am pretty attached. I have 5 dolls, all of which I have felt a connection to when purchasing. The Etsy doll was the second doll I bought. I did not notice any activity after buying this specific doll. My boyfriend came over today. We've been dating about 3 months. He is spiritually aware. He must have gotten off the bed and snapped the porcelain foot of one of the dolls. This is not the Etsy doll. The foot was already broken, and I did glue it back together a few months ago. He noticed the foot when putting his shoes on. He was apologizing, and I told him it was okay, and he ended up going to splash his face with some water. Before going, he did leave the doll slouched with the foot laying next to her. I was playing on my phone, and he comes back and sits on the floor. He starts telling me the doll was no longer slouched, and she was staring right at him. My boyfriend is thoroughly convinced this doll has moved, and she is upset. He left shortly after, and did text me a warning that the doll may be attached to me personally, and that I should sage my room in case. I personally have only had one experience, which happened with another one of my dolls when I was spending the summer with my grandma. But I had not slept in 2 days and can't truly say that anything actually happened. Any advice?
So when I was 7 through 9, I don't remember what age I was, I had this doll that was about as tall as a German Shepherd dog. This doll had a voice box where if you pressed it, the doll would laugh and giggle for about 30 seconds. This voice box was placed in a pocket in the back of the doll's dress. Eventually, I kinda got annoyed of the voice box due to it going off a lot. Before this incident, I had thought that some stuff behind it was pressing it or that the pocket was sewn on too tightly, so it was pressing the box when there was pressure on the pocket. So, as I said, I got annoyed of the box. So I had emptied out a drawer and placed the box in the drawer. I had closed the drawer carefully so as not to move the box in the slightest. After this, I went to sleep. At maybe midnight, I had woken up to the sound of the box coming from the doll I had made sure to place on the opposite side of the room from the drawer the box was in. Forgetting for a minute that I had taken the box out of the doll, I tried to go back to sleep. About 5 minutes later, I remembered where I put the box and got up to open the drawer. It was still there, exactly where I had left it. A few weeks later, I got rid of the doll. However, for a few years after that, I could still hear the laughter of the doll's voice box. I only remembered this incident when I had found one of my porcelain dolls on the kitchen counter. My mom had moved it for some reason.
We had a little doll that had a spirit attached to it. We even had a paranormal team come to take it to a museum with other haunted artifacts local to us. We found it with another doll at a yard sale. They were both missing the same side leg. We joked with the owners about them being haunted, and we bought them both for $5. When we got in the car to leave the yard sale we found the dolls at, it started to hail, with the sun still shining. We ended up going to eat because there was no way we could continue shopping at yard sales in the rain. After we got done eating, about an hour later, we went to another yard sale a block away from where we got the dolls from. Everything was dry, and nothing was out of place. I asked the lady, how did she keep her stuff dry when that hail had come through, and she didn't know what I was talking about. If my fiancé wasn't there with me, I don't know if I would have believed myself. That night, my fiancé had a real bad dream about the smaller doll, and it was telling him to kill me. He woke up and thought he actually hurt me. I joined some groups and shared the picture of the dolls on Facebook. They immediately knew it was a little doll. My friend showed her mum the picture of the doll. Her mum wanted to come see it before the paranormal team took it. When they got to my apartment, she went to hold the doll but immediately sat back down because the energy was so overwhelming. I asked her if I should try to hold it because it was my doll. She said sure. I picked it up, and as soon as I did, I felt this sensation like a high almost start to come in through my feet and slowly inch its way up my body. When it got to my neck, I started choking and sobbing uncontrollably. Everyone yelled at me to put it down. I put it down, and the feeling went much faster back down out through my feet, the same way it came in. My aunt almost died when she was in a car wreck and could feel her soul leaving through her feet. Whatever it was tried entering my body for sure. We all wanted to go outside to get some fresh air after that. We walked outside between the apartment buildings, and on the deck behind me all of a sudden there were like 5 big crows behind me on the balcony screeching at me like they wanted to attack us. Well, my friend and her mum went home. I don't blame them. Anyways, the paranormal team comes. The air is so heavy when you walk into my apartment. You can literally feel the energy. They start blessing the dolls and the house, and the neighbor's dog is howling the whole time, which it never does. The lady carried a white stone to keep her grounded and protected, and she started freaking out because the stone turned hot. It was all so crazy. I'm so glad I have so many witnesses. In pictures, if you look at the one doll, if you zoom into its right eye, you can see the outline of a little boy's face. I didn't even notice that until this past year when somebody pointed it out to me. Several people told me it was the spirit of a little boy. I have been interested in the paranormal for as long as I can remember, and have been investigating the paranormal for about 12 years now. I purchased 3 haunted dolls a year ago, and up until now, all has been quiet, except for one incident that happened a few months ago. A few months ago, I was laying in bed desperate to use the bathroom, but not wanting to brave the cold. Being the only person in the house, I hear someone "Psst" behind me. It takes me a minute to brave turning over, But when I did, there was nothing and nobody there. I have no explanation for this sound. None of my electronics make this noise, nor does anything else in my house. My cats do not have access to my bedroom or the hallway leading to the bedroom while I sleep. We can't hear their noises from the bedroom. Then nothing more, until last week. My partner has a cylindrical massage roller. It sits underneath the exercise bike. So we're sitting, watching TV, and the roller rolls across the room out of nowhere. Nothing interacted with it. I accept that there is a possibility that it could have fallen, but with how it usually sits, it seems unlikely. It also has never happened before, and hasn't happened since. My cats have one of those little balls that light up when something touches it. The last 2 days, it's been lighting up randomly on its own. I hear this can happen when the batteries are low, but this was a fresh ball, about a week ago. And today, sitting quietly scrolling social media, the guitar that sits on the stand across the lounge from the sofa randomly rings out. All cats were sleeping at the time. Nothing was around it to fall and hit the strings. Again, I just don't have an explanation for it. I plan to do some EVP work with the dolls and see whether anything comes of it. But my house also sits on the site of an old hospital and has a church and cemetery just across the street too. So who knows what might be going on. This is super exciting for me, but I'm trying to keep my skeptical brain on and trying to debunk everything. I'll keep you all updated with any new happenings. Update. Things have been quiet for a few days now. It feels kind of eerie with nothing happening. Almost like the feeling you get of calm before a storm. I'll add further updates if and when anything else happens. Update 2. Scratching continues. It's happening in the daytime now too. I have searched high and low for the source and have come up empty. Balls continue to flash on their own, but nothing new yet. I hope to get some quiet time in the next few weeks to try some EVP. Update 3. I was woken up to scratching again yesterday night, followed by a woman quietly singing. This is completely new activity. Every other time I've heard something that sounded like a voice, it was always male. Update 4. Laying in bed last night, trying to get some sleep, but struggling. I heard a male voice grunt behind me, as if someone was turning over in their sleep in the bed next to me. It took me a moment to realize that my partner was not yet in bed, so this noise couldn't be coming from him. I've never been scared of any of the paranormal activity I've experienced before, not even when I've been physically touched. But for some reason, this felt different. Wrong somehow, and I jumped out of bed and literally ran to the lounge shaking. My partner searched the bedroom in case someone had broken in and we hadn't realized. There was nobody to be found. This one left me shaken, and I can't yet put my finger on why.
This is something I experienced shortly before moving out of one of my teenage homes a couple of years ago. When I was around 13 or 14 years old, my great-grandmother used to collect dolls. One of the dolls I took a particular liking to because of how goddamn creepy it looks. She picked up on it and actually gave it to me not too long before she passed away. Fast forward to the story at hand. My 2 stepbrothers and I were sitting in the living room chatting late at night, around 1 a.m. or so. For context, this is a cookie cutter house, so when you walk in, you basically have to choose between going upstairs or downstairs. The living room is directly upstairs from the front door. There is a fireplace on the left-hand wall, but not much else to note since it was an open concept. Adjacent to the wall, there was the railing overlooking the doorway area, and in front of the railing is the couch. There is also a television sitting on the ground on the wall opposite to the couch. During our conversation, we got on the topic of childhood paranormal experiences. Joking around, I went and grabbed the doll from my bedroom and leaned it up on the shelf above the fireplace. I made sure when I put the doll up there that it was leaning securely so as not to slip off. Some things that are now important. The television is on, but just in the no signal screen. And because we were preparing to move, there are boxes and trash bags piled in front of the fireplace, at least 3 to 5 feet out. We were all sitting on the couch at the time this happens. In the middle of a story, my younger stepbrother was telling about an experience he had in the basement of a childhood home. The doll was flung forward from the shelf, landing a good feet away from the boxes, meaning it flew a good 6 to 8 feet away from the fireplace. At that exact same time the doll made contact with the ground, the television shut itself off and turned itself back on. We have never had any electrical issues in that house, or with that TV. Needless to say, we about pissed ourselves. I know people are going to say it's possible that the doll had just fallen, but the doll flew forward off of the shelf, even though it was leaning backwards. And things that fall don't typically fall outward several feet. Let me know what you think. If this post gets traction, I'll post a picture of the doll.
So, I used to work at a haunted Halloween store. Anyone who worked there often had some creepy story from encountering the ghosts. We had a homeless man with a collection of dolls who lived out behind our store. He probably wasn't the first homeless guy to live there. It was a good spot. I bought an animatronic Pennywise clown from that store at a fantastic discount. I was so excited when I brought him home. He and my animatronic collection bring the neighborhood and me and my family so much joy around Halloween. My house was not haunted, but after we brought him home, weird things started happening. For example, I woke up one night to a clown standing at the foot of my bed. It wasn't just a nightmare thing either. It stayed there after I blinked and jumped up screaming. But when we put Pennywise away down in the basement, the activity stopped. We've had him since 2019. Every time I bring him upstairs, the stuff starts happening. Lights flicker. 2 years ago, the light in my bathroom started going off like a strobe light. My toddler saw it too, and asked if we could shut the door because it was scaring him. It went on and on for like half an hour. One time, Pennywise's eyes glowed, and he was not plugged in. My husband saw this one too, if I remember right. The last season, when we brought him upstairs, he moved, turning his whole body towards me, while I was sitting in my chair. He wasn't plugged in. Even after he was plugged in, he didn't move like that. It would have required deliberate effort to move him like that. Also, a bulb upstairs started flickering like a strobe light, and wouldn't stop until I acknowledged it and filmed it. It had a clear rhythm to it, and went on for several minutes. I got the distinct impression he wanted to go back into the basement. I did an EVP and video session when I was alone with my toddler asleep, and I caught distinct rhythmic bangs on the wall next to me. Not anywhere near the room my toddler was in. I also caught a possible light anomaly. About the lights, none of these lights ever died, or even flickered again after these instances. We put Pennywise back into the basement after Halloween. My husband set him up so he's looking out of the window. A few odd things happened, helpful things. I was looking for something all over. I'd looked in my bedroom multiple times. I go back in there, and there the thing was, right in front of my nightstand, nicely folded, and where I put my feet when I get up in the morning. It hadn't been there before. Music started playing on my phone when I needed to be somewhere, and hadn't set my alarm. You would have had to deliberately push a button to get this music to play. Then it just stopped. It was almost like he was saying, "Thanks for putting me back in the basement, and with a view." However, when I'm going through a hard time, I will smell cigarette smoke and alcohol. No one in my house smokes or drinks, yet sometimes the smell is so strong I can taste it. I've also smelled perfume, and no one wears perfume in my house. I have a sensory sensitivity to smell. Most perfumes make me sick. That's when I really wish I had a spirit box. I have questions, but I really don't want to invite anything else into my home. I'm fine with this Pennywise ghost. Whoever they are, they're not mean. But I don't want anything negative in my home. It's our sanctuary. I really don't know what to do. I guess it doesn't matter. I don't have to talk to it. But I'm just really curious. I've had dolls my entire life. Baby dolls, porcelain dolls, Barbie dolls. I think you get it at this point. I like them just fine. My dad fears them, and as kids my sister and I would joke about it with him, since my great-grandmother's house is filled with all kinds of dolls and porcelain statues. But in recent years, especially right now, something feels off. I'm going to dive straight into it. My sister recently moved in with us due to her being unhappy living with my biological mother. She is in high school and naturally grew out of wanting her American Girl doll. I would say I'm the proud owner of two, except here's the thing. The home my sister was in was charged with so much negative and tense energy. I know she did not mean to bring any negative spirits into our home, and I do not blame her for this. I love my sister very much, and it was kind of her to give me her Josephina doll with the little things and clothing that came with her. It is a beautiful, well taken care of doll, but I can feel something is very wrong with it. Even as I am sitting here typing this out, I feel like something is watching me, something very bad and unwelcome in my parents' home. I am fearing the worst, but I am not crying for help, nor do I need it, because I feel like I should try to assess this situation myself before I decide to involve others with this dark energy that seems to radiate off this doll. Right now, she is very strong. I'm afraid to go near the shelf she is sitting on at the moment. When I first got her, I changed her outfit and felt this very sad energy. Even the doll looked sad, as if it witnessed something truly heartbreaking and awful. Now it feels evil and insidious. I never have gotten this feeling from any doll I've received as a gift in my entire life. I'm an adult and really shouldn't be acting like a scared child, but this is terrifying. I feel uneasy and an overwhelming sense of dread, but I do not feel like I need to relocate at the moment, since I feel like I am strong enough to fight whatever this thing may be. I need to protect my family, and I will do it. I've no option but to do this myself. I hate running from things like this and refuse to do it at this time. At the same time, I do not know nor possess the ability to cleanse this doll. I don't trust online sources for these types of situations. Many things will mislead you. I don't like the idea of putting the doll away because I don't want my sister to feel sad. But at the same time, I don't want to tell her the reason so she doesn't think I'm crazy. My stepmom is spiritual, but she would just think that I'm overreacting and acting like a scared child. My dad would probably agree with me, but that is just because he is afraid of dolls in general. He's not really into the spiritual side of it, nor gives it much thought like I do. It is probably for the best too. I don't know. Maybe my stepmom would believe me, but say that I'm overreacting for fear of manifesting in the fear even more. She is wise like that, but she's also turning a blind eye, and that solves nothing. I think I know who gave it this bad energy too. I will not refer to them because they are bad, and they give off the worst evil energy. I respect people, but this person in my life, as well as my sister's, is truly an evil being. I cannot forgive this person either. This doll has a story, and not a happy one to tell me either. This is just the beginning of things too. I keep seeing shadows of a man out of the corners of my eyes, regardless of the time of day or night. I went downstairs to get some water when I saw it very clearly this time. The resemblance it took to the person was exact. Same shadow and same figure, shape and height. I almost dropped my cup. I am contemplating on telling a close friend of mine, but also refuse to burden them with something as silly sounding as this. I hope these occurrences stop and I can put it out of my mind. I am wearing a rose quartz bracelet that has other stones that I unfortunately do not remember the names of, but it does protect me to an extent. It may sound silly to all of you, but this bracelet was made by very good people and their energy shines through this bracelet. I hope it helps me fend off whatever this is, and that I can tell it to leave me alone before I have to act upon it and drive it away forcefully myself. I'm not afraid to do anything I need to protect my parents and my sister, even if it means I have to get my stepmother's blowtorch for her creme brulee. Before you say it's just a doll, it's harmless, think again. I said that once too. I was very mistaken, very stupidly mistaken. I hope this never happens to any of you, and do not wish this upon anybody. It is a very painful and draining experience to go through.
I don't have any explanation for this other than the fact that I was 8 and maybe imagined it. But that doesn't explain the 14-year-old neighbor babysitting me being equally scared because she saw the same thing, and the couple next door also mentioning seeing strange things. There were also rumors that the 3rd floor in the apartment complex we lived in caused people to see stuff, but nothing this extreme ever happened. This happened during the winter. No one went outside much, but my parents had to leave for work for long hours and often left me with a neighbor. She stayed in our apartment, and I usually spent time messing around on her phone in the kitchen. We were playing a game when we heard something outside. So, we both stared into the window and figured it was a pigeon. But not long after the noise, down came flying a leg. Not a boot or a shoe, but what looked to be a full-blown human limb falling off the 4th floor balcony. She just stared in bewilderment, and I was really confused as to what had just happened. Her first thought was that it must have been something else, so she looked down to check, but nothing was on the ground. I also looked down and almost fell out of the window, and really, nothing was there. She just ended up brushing it off as a boot that fell from the balcony. We continued doing whatever in the kitchen when there was a noise again, and this time an arm fell from the balcony. Nothing was on the ground again, so the neighbor just dragged me back into her apartment and texted my mum that I'll be waiting there because something was happening. To this day, we're still confused about the whole thing. People from the 2nd floor said they didn't see anything, and people from the 4th floor denied anything falling from anybody's balcony. The only people who did see anything were people from our floor. This was just one of the many strange things that happened while my family still lived there, and I still kind of shudder when thinking back on it. I always chalked it up to maybe a fungus or a gas or something of the sort on our floor causing people to hallucinate. But surely we wouldn't all hallucinate the same things.
This isn't a work of fiction intended to scare you. It is my account of a ghost that lived in my apartment. I have only told a few people this, and it is from 20 years ago when I was in college. I lived in student housing with 4 roommates in our pod. It was 5 bedrooms and shared kitchen and bathroom for those 5 bedrooms. The bedrooms were all in a row on one side of a long hallway. My room was on the end opposite the front door, and the kitchen was at the far end of the hall, and the bathrooms were opposite the bedrooms. On multiple occasions when leaving my room late at night, before I could turn my head, out of the corner of my eye there was a nurse standing at the far end of the hall facing me. Now, there is a nursing program at this college, so a nurse in student housing was a normal occurrence. This nurse, however, was dressed in a manner more appropriate to the 1940s or 50s. Definitely not 2000s scrubs that the current students wore. Now, more than a sight out of the corner of my eye, I would also feel a presence strong enough that I knew someone was there. The best similar feeling I could think of is when there is someone sitting directly behind you in a theatre or on public transit. You can't see them, but you can feel their presence, and you know they are there. The second I turned my head, the feeling disappeared, and there was no nurse. There was nobody at all. Just 4 locked bedrooms and an empty kitchen and bathrooms. Yes, I checked every room. Since it wasn't particularly exciting or scary, I dismissed it. I assumed it was because I was tired and it was late at night. I repeatedly saw the nurse on at least a monthly basis. 1 month, I saw her every week. Nothing I could do to see her better. If I resisted turning my head, the feeling would remain until I looked her way. That's all that ever happened. I never told anyone about the nurse because at this point, it was a pretty boring story. Plus, I didn't exactly believe in ghosts. So what was I actually going to tell them? That my mind played a trick on me when I was tired? That's not exactly news. During one of our parties, a classmate of mine asked who the nurse was. My roommates dismissed it because we had all been drinking. I asked him what he saw, and he said she was dressed old-timey and she disappeared fast. I told him there was no nurse here, and he said he knew someone was there, but since there was nowhere for the nurse to hide, he let it go. 2 years later, a friend from my hometown came to visit. Halfway through her visit, she asked why I didn't tell her about the nurse who lived here. I said because there is no nurse who lived here. She got a confused look on her face and said, "Then who was wearing the costume?" I said, "I don't know." To be very clear, I never told either friend I sometimes saw a nurse ghost in my apartment, and they don't know each other, so they couldn't have shared their story. I don't know what was actually going on in that apartment, but looking back on it now, I find it fun that it was actually a ghost. This is my first post here, so please be patient with me through my jumbled stories. I'll do my best to make everything as clear as possible. When I was 10 years old, my mother and I moved to this apartment complex in Claremore, Oklahoma, and we stayed there until I was about 12 years old. To start, I should let you know that my mum worked for the complex as a maintenance tech, so I will include some creepy stuff that she encountered that will also feed into the weirdness. My first encounter happened within the first week of moving in. This was my first time having my own room, so I was incredibly excited to decorate it with Minecraft souvenirs and Star Wars memorabilia. And by the time I finished decorating, I was as slumped as a 10-year-old could be, so I decided to hit the sheets in my brand new bed. My dog, Buddy, and I got comfortable in the new bed and went to sleep with a light-up star machine, basking in the ceiling with the galaxy and countless stars. Now keep in mind how I said Buddy was in bed with me. I quickly fell asleep, which is super unusual because I suffer from insomnia. To my surprise, I woke up sometime before 4 a.m. I didn't wake up feeling well rested and ready for a day full of Legos and fruit snacks. I woke up feeling groggy and confused, but that wasn't the weird part of this. My dog Buddy was standing outside my open bedroom door, growling and staring into my lit-up bedroom, and that scared the heck out of me, because Buddy wasn't a vocal pup and had never growled, barked, or made any sounds due to him being a service doggo. I sat there calling to him, trying to get him to come back into my room, but he wouldn't budge. So I got out of my bed and walked out of my room to see what was wrong with him. As soon as I cleared the door, he stopped making sounds and sat there looking up at me with these concerned eyes, trying to tell me something that I wish I could understand. So I walked down the dark hallway to see if my mum was still up and watching TV.
to no surprise, the house was still and she was sleeping in her room. This entire time, Buddy was closely following me, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary, other than being really spooked. So I turned back to go to my room. When we reached my room, I walked in, and Buddy stood at the door and stared at me, not wanting to go any further. So I once again called to him, which soon turned into commands, telling him to come, but this guy wouldn't go any further, standing there, staring at me with worried eyes. I was undoubtedly scared, so being a wee lad, I closed my door to protect me from any would-be danger, and got back into bed and eventually fell asleep. But he never went into that room again. He slept right outside the door from that point on. Okay, so if this story doesn't convince you that some creepy stuff was happening, the next one will. So I've lived in Chicago for 6 years now, and my first apartment here was definitely haunted. I've been a firm believer in the paranormal for years, ever since I was a kid, and found books in my local library about ghosts in the non-fiction section, which of course, I believed it to be common real knowledge back then. I always wondered what it would be like to live in an actual haunted house. Well, I now know. When my roommate and I first moved into this apartment, we were blown away by how cheap the rent was and how large and accommodating the unit was. The owner of the apartment was a little old lady who we'll call Janet, who couldn't realistically live there anymore because it was a 3-story walk-up unit and her old age was starting to get to her. She had saved up enough to get a retirement condo by the lake, but didn't want to give up her old apartment entirely, so she decided to rent it out. Nothing crazy happened at first. It was slowly over time that my roommate and I started to notice more and more bizarre things. Like most experiences people have in similar situations, it started out as unexplainable bumps and thuds. This was an older building that had radiator heating, so most of the noises you could attribute to that. But sometimes, things would happen. You would hear what sounded like footsteps walking down the hallway, only for no one to appear when they should have. The sound of someone scratching something seemed to occur around you at random times. There was once I was in my room, probably browsing Reddit, and I heard a scratching sound coming from directly underneath a discarded plastic bag near my wastebasket. We've had mice get into the apartment before and die, so I figured it was a mouse or something. When I threw a pen next to the bag to spook whatever it was from underneath, the scratching continued to happen uninterrupted. When I finally stood up and picked the bag up, there was absolutely nothing underneath. The scratching bag never made a noise again. Sometimes when you were lying down trying to sleep, there was a sudden feeling that someone had just entered the room, even with the door closed. Hard to explain, but it was just a different type of energy. I would also feel the same energy dissipate, as if whatever it was that came in left. My roommate once claimed to actually see a pair of floating eyes as he walked down the hallway late one night. Also, while he was sick once, he swore he saw a woman standing in the kitchen from down the hallway. When he looked again, she was gone. 2 of the most insane occurrences there had witnesses. Otherwise, I would feel like I would be doubting my own sanity. One was when a friend of mine who was visiting and I were sitting on my couch in the living room. I had just finished a cup of yogurt and put it down with the spoon still resting in it. It sat undisturbed for a couple of minutes, and then we both saw it completely do a 360 spin on its axis. It's as if it tilted itself back and then spun, and then sat right back down. My friend and I sat speechless for a second before he said, Did you just see that?" The other instance was when the same friend was staying over on an inflatable mattress in our dining room. For context, our apartment was basically the shape of a dumbbell. You entered into the living room, and then to your right was the hallway. There was my roommate's room on your first left, the bathroom door, which also had a connecting door to my roommate's room, on your next left, and then finally, my room on your final left. The hallway opened up into a small dining room which fed directly into the kitchen. This night in particular, we had been drinking and smoking and what have you. We went to bed, and a massive thunderstorm passed through. The sound of thunder woke me up at around 3:30 a.m. That, and the sound of my roommate puking in the bathroom. He had had some bad egg rolls apparently. As I'm laying there listening to the sound of him vomiting in the thunderstorm, I hear my friend, who was in the dining room, get up, walk down the hallway, and stop directly in front of the bathroom door. I thought to myself, that's weird that he's getting up to check on John. He knew John in college. He should know he can take care of himself. But there was no knock on the bathroom door. No anything. I didn't think much of it and fell back asleep. When the morning came, I sat in the living room with my roommate and mentioned how our guest had gotten up to check on him. I heard him too, my roommate said. I wondered why he was just standing outside the bathroom door. Our friend eventually woke up and joined us. But when we asked him why he did that, he just stared at us and said, I heard that too, but I thought that was you getting up to check on John. From his perspective, I can see how he thought it was someone else because the steps were walking away from where he was in the dining room. After I thought about it some more, I realized I never heard any more footsteps after those initial ones. And if it had been my friend, I would have heard him go back to his air mattress. That's the one that has never left my mind. All three of us heard the same thing. We like to think it was just checking on my sick roommate. All in all, to answer my own question of what it would be like to live in a haunted house, the answer is you just go to bed and pretend it isn't happening. As promised, this will be the rest of my encounters and such. For anyone that isn't caught up, these are encounters that I had when I lived in an apartment complex when I was 10 to 12 years old. If you listen to the first story, then you should have an idea of what kind of creepy stuff went on from the start. But to continue this experience, I'm going to tell you about a really weird neighbor that lived above my apartment. I had first met this lady when I was sitting outside on my porch with a couple of pals that I had met in the complex. She had walked downstairs and introduced herself, a name that I couldn't even bother to remember, but for the sake of this story, we'll call her Karen. She said that she lives upstairs and that she also has a boy, and we should hang out sometimes because he's super shy and never likes to come outside. Which was weird because I had seen her a few times before, leaving her apartment, and she never had a boy with her. But to be kind, I politely accepted the offer to meet her son, and she said she would set up something for us. Karen turned around and went back upstairs to her apartment. So as time went on, my mum and I would hear really strange things coming from her apartment through the ceiling, like crying, things falling, and constant stomping. No joke, 2 to 4 in the morning, repetitive stomping. But one night, it really topped the cake. My mum and I were sitting in the living room playing my PlayStation 2, when there was this incredibly loud bang and a thud upstairs, and then we heard what sounded like screaming and crying. At this point, I was shaking and looked to my mum for some kind of answer, but the look on her face showed glimpses of fear and confusion. But this didn't make me feel any better because my mum is a hard sumbitch. My mum decided to call the police for a welfare check on our neighbor and explained everything that we had heard. So, some 15 minutes later, the police show up and we watched them walk upstairs to her place
We're listening closely to see what's happening, and so they knock a few times, but there's no answer. After a couple of minutes of them knocking, Karen finally answers the door, and sounds like she's drunk, because she's slurring her words, and the officers are asking her if she's okay, and if she needs to sit down, or if they need to call her a paramedic. Over the next few minutes they talk to her, and pretty much get nowhere, and she's not letting them into her apartment, so they have to just wrap it up and leave. The rest of the night, we sit inside wondering what happened up there. A few days later, my mum suggests to go upstairs to see if her son might want to come and hang out and play some games. I really didn't want to because of all the creepy things that we had heard from up there, but let's just put it like this, I didn't have much of a choice. So I go ahead and walk my ass up there and knock on her door, and I kid you not, she opens the door within 10 seconds of me knocking. I shrug it off and introduce myself again, and she reminds me that she knows who I am with a friendly smile, and asks what she can do for me. I ask if her son is home, and if he can come hang out with me downstairs and play some games. Now, I get to catch a few looks inside her crib, and it was the weirdest thing I'd ever seen. The place was spotless and barely had any furniture. It just shook me the wrong way, if you know what I mean. So this is where things get weird. The lady sits there and says she doesn't have a son. I'm kinda confused, so I get quiet for a second, but then try to remind her of the day we met and how she invited me to come meet her son. At this point her face turns sour and she looks angry. She says I'm confused and that she doesn't have any kids and says that I need to leave or she'll call the cops or something like that. So I just walk away, cause I'm already weirded out. I go downstairs and tell my mum what happened, and she chops it up to the lady being mentally disabled. So about 2 months later the lady gets up and just leaves. All her stuff was still there, and everything. So as I previously stated in the first story, my mum was a maintenance tech for the apartment complex, so she would go into the recently empty apartments to fix holes, paint, replace broken appliances, etc. So when she went up to Karen's place, she let me go with her so I could help and get out of the house and such. When I went up there with her, I got to look around and see everything just the way she left it. Going through the apartment, we noticed a few things that made no sense. Like absolutely no pictures or any personal belongings that would tell you who lived there. All of her clothes were still there. And to top it all off, the second bedroom was decorated for a young boy, and that's including a closet with clothes. This apartment was empty until my sister moved into it a few months later. So the next few things that happened can't be explained. Over these next few months, my mum and I would hear stomping, running, thuds and bangs all coming from upstairs. The leasing manager and my mum called the police multiple times because they thought people were squatting upstairs, but every time they found nothing, and it came to the point where they padlocked the door for extra insurance, but the sounds never stopped. The next story is a quick one, but is still spooky. One day my mum was home cooking and doing her thing, while I was out with my pals, running around and being a hood rat. My mum had called me and was pissed because apparently I had run inside and slammed the doors on my way out. At this point, I'm like in the woods with my pals, super confused, telling her that I haven't been home since I left, so it couldn't have been me. She then told me she was in the bathroom and heard the front door open and then a bedroom door open, and when she called for me, she got no response back, and then heard the front door slam really loud. So she got up and ran into the living room thinking it was me, and probably ready to bust my ass for slamming doors. But I reassured her that I was not anywhere near the house, and hadn't been for a few hours. Nothing really happened after this, but it for sure spooked the both of us for the minute. Now let's get to the most terrifying thing to happen out of the entire time I lived there. This is about my next door neighbor. This lady was really kind from the moment I met her until the moment she moved out. But she was into some weird stuff. Let me catch you up on some of the things we noticed from her. She was a really heavy drinker, and countless times she would drink so much that she would pass out in her place with her door wide open and all her stuff there for anybody to snatch. This one morning, I walked out of my front door because I heard music, and her door was wide open with wine glasses sitting on her porch chair, her phone right next to it. I would tell my mum. She would go and take all of her stuff and set it inside her place, then close the door and lock it with the extra master key. Now, like I mentioned before, she was incredibly kind, and multiple times she would let me come into her apartment and pick a few movies from her vast collection to borrow. She even made me some brownies for my birthday one year. But with that being said, there was some shady stuff about her. Like, she was into all the dark, creepy witchcraft type stuff. And she and her apartment reflected that 100%. She had painted her walls black and had all the gothic decorations you could wish for. Now, I'm noting that because it applies to the story. This isn't just me being a judgmental prick. Now that you know her, we can get into the spooky stuff. One night, my mum and I were in her room, watching a movie, and it was pretty late. Probably about 12 to 3 a.m. But the neighbor had music playing really loud in her apartment. That never bothered us because we didn't share walls with her, so we usually just ignored it. But on this night, it was really loud, and we just cut that up to her just being really drunk. So we're just chilling, watching our movie when, out of nowhere, we hear a scream that would make the angel of death jump in his skin. And followed by that scream was her running out her apartment, butt-ass naked, screaming and begging somebody to help her because something was trying to kill her and take her soul. My mum and I are already at our door when she runs outside and takes off through the hallway, leading to the stairs heading down to the street. My mum takes off after her to see if she's okay, and I'm just standing there terrified and wondering what had just happened. When my mum gets back to the apartment, she has the lady by the arm and takes her inside our apartment and into the bathroom until the cops got there. They eventually took her to a hospital because they thought she was having a psychotic break. My mum then explains to me that the lady said that she was sleeping in her bed when she was woken up to a dark demon in the corner of her bedroom, screaming at her and telling her that he will take her soul. When my mum caught her, she was shaking like a leaf and crying frantically, begging my mum to help her because she didn't want to die. She moved not long after this. But wait, there's more. When my mum cleaned up her apartment, she had to repaint the entire place because it was all black. But that's not unusual. When it came to painting the second bedroom, my mum noticed the ceiling was peeling really bad. So she had to scrape off this old paint to reapply new paint. But when she was peeling off the paint, she found dried red splatters all over the ceiling. So of course she had to tell the boss, and they called the police. The police took samples and eventually got back to the manager and said it was animal blood. Now, this all clicked for us because our neighbor had gotten new kittens multiple times but seemed to never keep them for very long. But you can decide what to think about that information. Now this is really all of the major stories I have, but I can tell you that it didn't end there. I slept in my room for about a year of living there, but after that I slept on a pallet in my mum's bedroom until we moved, mainly because my dog would never sleep in there, and I would constantly wake up to loud thuds on my walls and would hear weird sounds during the day. One of my mum's co-workers moved into a different apartment because she claimed that she was experiencing scary stuff too. We had also heard that this complex was built on an ancient Native American burial site, but I've never fact-checked that, so take it with a grain of salt. Castletown is a Scottish village, and a long time ago witches used to gather in the old mill buildings to worship their master. Fine details will be spared in this story because we do not want to offend nor condemn those who are still alive. On a late winter's night, a coven of 13 gathers around an old stone altar where they meet and greet one another. But this was not to last long. An old fisherman and a busybody wife decide that this was no place for such creepy goings-on, and they call the police. The 13 split ways and re-meet the following week at a different location within the same area in Castletown. The 13 were annoyed and upset at the locals but continue their rituals, laughing and dancing around the small fire in the alternative location. Weeks passed, and all was quiet in the village. All gossip of the 13 passed, and the locals found new things to talk about. An older man from the village was out on a moonlit night because he and his wife had had a disagreement, so he took a walk. He walked around the old harbour, then headed up past where the old dump used to be. He was being careful because he knew there was a quarry and it contained a deep hole of water. He could hear for miles on the calm night, and he did hear things. He heard a cry of a boy. "Help! Help! Help!" The old man headed towards the body of water, calling out as he went. The man heard splashing, gurgling, more splashing. Horrified, he ran across the quarry's broken stones and got to the edge of the water. Nothing. The moon shone upon the water. It was as still as the night. Afraid and shaken, the old man heads for home and calls the police to report what he heard. A search was conducted, but found nothing. Once a year on the very same night the 13 had met, if you are in that area you can still hear the boy drown. The quarry is no longer there, and the dump is long gone too. Trees are planted there now, and people still report hearing splashing, along with boys' screams of help. Locals who remember this story blame the 13 for this cursed haunting. When I was 13-14, I was staying at a hostel in Ireland. This hostel was directly next to, supposedly, one of the most haunted places in Ireland, an abandoned mansion. In fact, the hostel was built from the bricks of the mansion. There was a story that a widow cursed someone in that mansion, and when they died, they remained. After hearing this, being a young and dumb 13-year-old, I decided to taunt the ghost. Big mistake. Nothing happened after I taunted the ghost until I went to bed. That night, to the very right side of my bed, I heard light breathing. I paid it no mind though because I've had experiences before, and breathing was not a huge alarm for me. Eventually, I fell asleep, and then I got a phone call on my phone between 3 to 5 a.m. It was likely family from back home in the US. I did not answer the call, and I tried to get back to sleep. But there was a problem. My comforter had fallen off the bed, to the right side of the bed, and the breathing was loud and raspy now. At this point, I was scared. I had never heard breathing so loudly before, and it just wouldn't stop. Needless to say, I didn't get my comforter out of fear, and thank God I didn't. In the morning, I was shocked by what I saw. To the right of my bed was a comforter laying on the ground, and it looked like a human was under it. I could make out the arms, legs, head. It was all there. To this day, I genuinely believe that if I reached out for my comforter, something would have reached back. I'd like to share a story with you all, but you will need some context. My grandma is from Olancho, Honduras. In those times, the only way to reach her area was via plane, because there were no roads, and it was very unsafe to travel by car. At the time, my grandma was fighting for my grandfather's love with another woman. Of course, my grandmother won, and had 4 kids and many grandchildren. Remember this. Fast forward, and I'm 14 years old, staying at my grandmother's apartment. The reason being, we were going to drive to Florida. It was going to be me, my little brother, my mother, my aunt, and her friend. but I was staying at my grandmother's until we left in the morning. I was sleeping in the living room. I had to pee, so I put my pants on. With that mission accomplished, I looked for the light switch on the exit door of the apartment. For some reason, I couldn't see it, even though it wasn't dark at all. The living room was just dimly lit. You could see everything in perfect clarity, but for some reason, there was no switch. So I turned my head towards the left, where there was a hallway towards the bathroom. I walked towards the switch, but before I do, I see a black figure. Not a shadow, but a completely black hooded figure, just standing there. I was thinking that my eyes were adjusting after just waking up, so I walked towards the switch. But as soon as I did, the figure walked towards me. I got scared and walked faster towards the switch, and the figure began to walk faster as well. I thought that if I turned on the light, it would go away. I get to the switch and turn it on. The figure was in my face for a split second after turning on the lights. I didn't say anything to anyone because I knew nobody would believe me. Fast forward to the next day on the road to Florida. We all heard albums, told stories, and one story my aunt said revealed everything. Apparently she met with a palm reader from El Salvador. She said that the palm reader told her future and something from our family's past. Apparently when my grandmother was fighting with the other woman to win my grandfather's love, the other woman went to her mother, who happened to be a voodoo priestess, and put a curse on my family. She went on to repeat what the woman told her about the curse. Your family will be haunted by a voodoo god. It's a black figure, no face. It will not harm you, but it will let you know it's there. I said, BS, tell me you're lying. Say you're lying. I then told them what I'd seen the night before. The rest of the drive was quiet after that. A couple of years after, my brother saw the figure on my bed. I'll tell that story tomorrow if anyone is interested. Okay, so after my last story, I thought I'd tell you the story of how my brother finally saw the voodoo god. I say finally because he used to complain that everyone has a ghost experience except him. Literally, everyone in our family has a ghost experience. My family is narcissistic and proud, so for them to admit the stuff like this while calling everything else crap is kinda telling. But I digress. My brother would complain that he wants to see it or have an experience. So, some context. At this point in time, I was going through a phase where I would jump scare people. It was funny. My brother got the majority of the jump scares. So he was paranoid of every turn because I could be hiding behind something. We were living in a 2-bedroom apartment, and we had to share a room, closet, bathroom, etc. So one summer night, I'm outside in my car, smoking a cigarette and talking to some people. My phone rings, and it's my brother. He asks where I'm at, and I say I'm outside the apartment, smoking. He keeps asking me where I really am and stop lying. I'm getting pissed and scared because I hate being called a liar, and he never acts like this. So I ask him in a serious tone, what the hell is going on? He says he thinks he saw it. I park my car and go home. I ask him what happened, and why does he think he saw it? He says he saw our bedroom door open slightly. As soon as you open the door, my bed is right there in front of you. The room was dark, but he says he saw the imprint of something sitting on the edge of my bed. He says he spoke to it, thinking it was me trying to scare him. He told me, he said, Nando, is that you? I know it's you, stop playing. Stop trying to scare me, I can see you, bitch. Then the figure gets up and walks into our closet. He continues, Nando, stop playing. I know you went into the closet, I'm not stupid. He turned on the lights and went in the closet to look for me, but it was empty. That's when he called me. His opinion on the paranormal changed after that. He knew not to mess with any of it. A few weeks ago, I responded to a question in this thread about whether or not curses are real, and I partially described an experience that happened to me concerning black magic and curses from Mauritius. This will be a long one, and everything I mention is real to me and the people who experienced it with me. I will say, however, I used to smoke a lot of cannabis in the past, which was what made me doubt if this was paranormal to begin with. However, I lived with a policeman who was also one of my best friends and never took drugs. I'm a British French guy who, until this happened, I actually classed myself as an anti-theist, as I hated religion. My dad was atheist, and my mum was Catholic, and I was brought up with a Christian way of life. However, I always rejected anything to do with it. I first met this girl, who was Mauritian and working for an airline, when I was living in London, UK. I met her on Plenty of Fish, I think, but it could have been any dating app. We chatted for a couple of weeks, and then decided to meet up when she came for her next flight to London. We connected straight away, and eventually started a relationship. After about 6 months to a year of being with her, I started noticing little things about her, such as sometimes she was very weak and couldn't even get out of bed, as well as cut marks on her body. I eventually wanted to know what was up with her, so pushed for her to tell me, and it turned out that she had the blessing of the Hindu deity Kali put on her when she was younger. Not only that, but she also told me that a curse was put on her family, whereby no female members of her family would be happy in their relationships. She lived with her sister and mother. I, at the time, was very skeptical, and although I didn't think she was lying about it, I did doubt what she was saying, and thought maybe that these marks on her body were from self-mutilation to some extent. I stayed with her for another 2 years after, and although I would notice these marks on her body and her telling me she felt weak, I didn't pay much attention to it, as I was pretty crazy about her. After about 2.5 years of being with her, I decided to go to Mauritius, and had planned to propose to her there. This is when I started to realize she was telling the truth, and it wasn't herself causing these marks on her body. In the run-up to me actually going to Mauritius, I had bought a ring and was living with my friend in a flat in West London. This is when me and my friend started to experience things firsthand. It started with small things like me putting an object down somewhere and then noticing it had moved when I went back to look for it. I eventually emailed myself over the months when these things took place, and have the emails open, which I will now condense into points below as to what this thing that was living with us did. By the way, my flatmate was called Lee. Lee's door opening on its own. Modem turning itself off twice. Cupboard door opening itself. Lee's flip-flops being moved. Dr. Pepper bottle being moved. Coat stand moving on its own when I walked past it. Lee noticed it move, not me. Lee's shoes being moved. Lee called me, but I only noticed after, and apparently he didn't call me. Plug switch next to modem turning itself off. Lee's laptop moved from being plugged in to being moved into his cupboard, hidden under a sheet. Moved my weed and can't find it. Later my mother found it in one of my plant pots when I had moved out. Turned a tap on in the kitchen. Knocking on the flat, 2 sets of 3 knocks. Flipped my laptop over. Came home from work to find my laptop upside down. Turned off modem by the wall socket. Hidden tobacco pouch, later found in the freezer. Cut back of my neck. Found tobacco in the freezer. Turned off my laptop and the switch on the wall to the modem at the same time. Lee's hanger spinning on its own in his cupboard. Turned off modem by the modem switch. Turned on living room light in the morning. Turned on Lee's radiator. Hidden my laptop mouse, which I later found weeks later. Shoved down my trainer. Cut back on my neck. We'll explain further down these points. Turned off my laptop and the switch on the wall to the modem at the same time. moved a bottle of whiskey next to my bed whilst I was in the room, flicked a picture of Hanuman, found a mouse in Nike trainer in living room. It had been shoved into the tip. These are all the things that happened that I can remember thanks to me emailing myself during the period from the 5th of January 2012 to the 25th of February 2012, when my last email to myself was. The most shocking to me in the above was that this thing cut my neck, and I can and will probably always remember that sensation. To give it a bit more context, I woke up in the night to a burning sensation at the back of my neck, then fell back asleep. The following day at work, I was in front of my computer and happened to touch the back of my neck without really thinking and felt a cut or scar. I went to the toilet and took a photo of the back of my neck as I remembered what had happened during the night, and I could see I had a cut there. That freaked me out quite a bit, as that was the first and only time this thing had actually touched me. I told my girlfriend about these things, and she conducted some rituals in Mauritius that involved pigs being killed in order to lift the curse. But that didn't seem to do much. I kept questioning her about what she was doing to help me, but she was very vague, as I think she didn't want to freak me out. I also had gone on a date with a girl some years before who was a spiritual healer, and we had kept in touch. She helped me out by doing remote readings and attempted to shift whatever was in my flat. I also burnt white sage and put salt around the flat, as was told that would help. I also started to pray to a Hindu deity called Hanuman and built a shrine for him. This was the only time in my life where I prayed to a deity or god and actually felt their presence. After a while, things started to quieten down, but my girlfriend broke up with me, stating that God didn't want us to be together. And I never even went to Mauritius. If anyone has experienced anything similar, I would love to hear about it. As, like I said, I was a non-believer before, but I'm actually grateful this happened to me, as I now feel as if I know what the world is really about. I keep seeing things that keep disappearing before me. Let me start with a little background. I grew up in a house that has well over 200 years of history. The property originally used to be a complex with a few buildings, but we will focus on the house where my family stayed. 2 rooms barely big enough for a single 6-foot person to lay down, a small shack toilet next to the rooms, and a well in the yard. The place was situated right next to a graveyard, and in one of the original rooms, there's a window facing the graveyard, and you could see the graves 2 feet away from you if you opened the window. It was so close. Nobody knows what the buildings used to be originally, nor when the original buildings were built. But with a bit of digging in local history and land records, I was able to dig up that it was originally used to be part of a royal estate, and changed hands since then 2 times before my family moved in a little less than a century ago. There is conflicting information about it being a taxation office around the 1700s and later being purchased by a trader. I don't have any information about the trader. I was unable to find anything, but the property had definitely changed hands to a different person since then, from whom finally my grandparents had bought the property from. Around that time, my country gained independence, and my grandpa was sort of involved in this independence movement as well. And the place had also become a spot where many of those resistance meetings were held in the different buildings in the complex. Much of the reason why my grandparents resided in such small rooms on one side of the complex. Around that time, 2 people committed suicide in one of the rooms in one of the buildings. There are legends that when it was still under the royal estate, a lot of people were killed here for one reason or another. My grandma used to tell me this, but I don't know much about it. Moving on, since I don't know much of what happened after that. After independence, most of the other buildings, excluding the house, were converted to a small hotel and modified and put up for rent as shops, and some presence from the independence movement occupied some parts of the other buildings in the complex. Anyways, around the 1960s, the area changed a lot. The graveyard was eventually moved. I don't know why, and the area was redeveloped. My grandpa also expanded the house where they stayed, but with the original structures incorporated into it. Built more rooms and better toilet, etc. He also purchased some adjacent plots at the time and built a wall around much of the perimeter. One day, a few years later, they will find a dead body floating in the well. Someone jumped the perimeter wall and committed suicide in the well. The body was taken out and the well was cleaned, and they continued drinking water from it. Later in the 70s, there was a bit of a communist uprising in the country, and a lot of violence took place. A person was stabbed to death inside of our house, and a bombing by communists of our house. A couple more were killed around the complex, as well in other buildings. After a decade or so, the political climate had much settled down, and my grandparents once more decided to expand the house, and this time build an entire new house right next to the old one, in the plots that were part of the graveyard previously. This is the little background of the house, much of which I didn't know until 3 years ago. Now my story begins. Since I was 3 years old, I apparently used to see a lady around the house and talk to her. But when someone would ask whom I was talking to, I would point and tell them, but nobody was there. Well, it's not just me with whom such incidents had taken place. My grandma used to see a lady in another building, and my parents have had similar experiences of seeing people around the house as well as some guests who didn't know anything about the house. But we will stick to what happened to me. This incident was when I was around 5 to 6 years old. One day at night, the power went out, and when the power returned, I saw this shadow of a humanoid creature with a fox-like tail going up the stairs. I saw it so vividly, I can still remember it now. And I got a fever immediately and was sick for a few days after that. Nothing much happened to me after that. Not anything that I can remember. But I think it was the beginning of my horror. When I was 12 to 13, I had this friend. One day when she came over to my house, she saw something, and she got so scared she immediately went home. She never talked to me again. Completely cut contact. We often got the vibes of someone staring at us, or going up and down the stairs. Everyone felt this in the house after that. Nothing much happened to me after that, until around 2016, when I was around 15 to 16. I started having dreams of talking to this girl who had glasses on. They were very vivid dreams. I still remembered her very clearly. Both of us were talking on the roof of the house, and she would tell me about herself. These dreams continued multiple times every night. Around the same time, my school crush used to come over to my house, and one day after she left my house, it was pretty late. She went to her home. She lived close by, and that night she woke up in the middle of the night and heard a voice calling her from a tree in her yard. When she took a look outside of her window, she saw someone hanging on the tree. Soon after this, she started keeping her distance. She was super frightened, and her family moved away to another city. Meanwhile, I continued to have dreams of the same girl, where we would confide so much of our stuff to each other. Then came one evening, around that time, that I saw this girl. The girl from the dreams I had been having for months. The same dreams. She was standing outside of my room. She called my name and turned around and left. I was in bed and I got up to run after her. But she had disappeared. But this was impossible, because I knew the front door was locked and nobody was there except me and my mum in the house. Nobody had seen her leave, there were a bunch of people working outside of the front door. She would have had to cross past them, and none of them saw her. Nor did I see her leave the front door, and my mum, who was also in the house at the time, saw and heard her clearly, and she also ran after her, but she did not seem to see where she went either. From that day on, I stopped having her dreams, but new problems started to arise soon after that winter. I saw that shadow creature with the foxtail again. This time, it was followed by a death in the house soon after. After that, it felt super uneasy for everyone to stay in the house. But after a few weeks, things had settled down a bit, till I started having super strange dreams. But since 2016, I would have these strange dreams or nightmares. Most days, they were mostly related to ghosts, and they continue to this day. And people still continue to see things around the house. So the other night, I was sitting on my porch smoking a cigarette, as I usually do late at night. I was home alone. My boyfriend was at work at the time, and I just hear really loud screaming. I look behind me and see what looks like a woman just walking down the street, screaming at the top of her lungs, and she looked right at me. My initial thought was maybe it was just some weirdo or someone under the influence of something. But after more thought, I realized that the scream didn't really sound human. It sounded like something I'd never heard before. After that, I thought maybe it was a skinwalker, but my mother informed me that chances are it was a banshee. For some backstory on why I think maybe she's warning me of my boyfriend's passing is because a couple of nights before the potential banshee sighting, me and my mum had very similar dreams. In my dream, my boyfriend had passed, and I was trying to figure out how to cope with his passing. In my mum's dream, I was giving birth to a child and kept saying, "I need to take care of the baby. I promised their father I would," hinting at the idea that the father was dead. I don't know what I saw, but I'm hoping for maybe some insight on banshees, and just help me figure out what I saw. I saw online that Irish families can have their own banshee, and I'm third-generation American from an Irish family, if that has any relevance. My gran was from Ireland. She told me and my cousins scary bedtime stories about the banshee. She once told us that when she was 13, she was running an errand for her mum with her sister Mary. They had to go through a wooded area to get to the next small town, which was their destination. There was a small stream where the kids used to fish and play. They were approaching the stream, and from a little distance, Mary said to Gran, "What's that, Annie?" They both stopped and looked. Beside the stream with her back to them was a figure of a woman with long dark hair. She wore a light-colored dress and her feet were bare. They were silent, so they could hear soft, gentle weeping. Without waiting another minute, my gran said her and Mary turned and ran the other way as fast as they could. When they got home, they told their dad about their adventure. Their mum weren't too happy that they returned without completing the errand. Their dad said it was probably the banshee. Their mum just rolled her eyes and mumbled something under her breath. The next day, a younger child that the family knew was found face down in the stream in the same place as they saw the woman. It is said that the banshee shows up just before a tragedy or death. Years later, I did some research, and it said that the banshee can also be known as a bringer of bad tidings, not just of death. So, I was sitting in my living room, scrolling through Reddit, and all of a sudden an ear-piercing shriek rang out. I froze and immediately messaged my other half, who was upstairs. "Did you hear that?" He comes down and sees me ashen-faced, sitting frozen on the sofa. Our first thought is, someone is hurt. We live in the middle of nowhere. Behind our house, there are huge orchards and some woods, and not long ago, there were 2 murdered women found in our area. One crime was very high profile in the UK, and the other locally. We instantly worried that some poor woman was being attacked, so we grabbed a torch and prepared to phone 999. Nothing outside. I was very shaken up, so other half went to the neighbours and adjoining house, and didn't hear anything, not a peep. The neighbours on the other side who came out to fill his wheelie bin said the same. I was dumbfounded. It was so loud. It sounded like it was coming from inside the house, it was that loud. Neighbours suggested a fox. If anyone has heard mating foxes, you'll know that it sounds awful. But this was not a fox screech. I have heard them many times before. And it wasn't a cat either, nor the pipes. The tally wasn't on. And I wasn't listening to music or a podcast. It was a woman's scream. After ruling out logical things, I started to wonder whether or not it was paranormal. Although this thought had already crossed my mind because the scream instantly brought back a foul memory that I tried very hard to repress. Many years ago, when I lived with my mum, I saw through the living room window a car parked outside the house that I thought I recognized. It looked like my granddad's car. There was a woman sitting in the back seat. I peered through the window to see if it was my nan, aunt or cousin. I was excited for an unannounced family visit. Then the woman, who did look a little bit like my aunt, turned to look at me through the window. I could see that her face was ashy grey. Her mouth opened unnaturally wide, with her jaw dropping further than it should be able to. Then, right in my ear, the loudest, shrillest scream I'd ever heard. I dropped to the ground, out of sight of the window and the woman. Mum found me on the floor. I don't know how much time had passed, but I was too scared to move. The next morning, we did get the news that Granddad had died in his sleep. Years later, I learned about the Banshee. For anyone who doesn't know, the Banshee is a figure in Irish and Welsh mythology. She is an omen of death. Before a death or bout of fatal illness or injury, she will appear to the forsaken person's family and scream or wail. I live in England, but my family on both sides are Irish, and on my father's side, Welsh. I had heard the term Banshee, but didn't know what it meant. I had only heard it used by older relatives who were describing a particularly unpleasant or shrill woman. Would you get a load of her squawking? Sounds like a bloody banshee. I assumed it was an old-fashioned term for a noisy woman. There are a lot of those. It was only a few years later, when I got interested in mythology, that I found out what the term actually means, and that I had encountered one. So, was that what I heard the other night? I texted my parents to see if they were okay. Sorry it's late. Weird question. You good? They both replied that they were fine. My nan, my only living grandparent, has cancer and is about to have an important scan. My dad was fine but also needed a scan. My mum was doing well but informed me that a great aunt had died, although she passed 10 days before the scream. So, if it was for her, the Banshee was very late. None of these things were out of the blue. Nan has been sick for a long time. Dad is getting on in the years and scans are regular. And the great aunt was 90 and had been in hospital for some time, leading up to her passing. So the Banshee, if that is indeed what the scream was, couldn't be related. Sorry for the essay, and thank you for taking the time to listen. I'm honestly quite anxious, and it's still ringing through my head. Any thoughts or suggestions, paranormal or not, would be greatly appreciated. Irish folklore is littered with mysterious and terrifying creatures. The kind that sounds so unbelievable, but that people speak of with such conviction that you can't help but wonder if there may be a layer of truth buried in there. Old people in particular still hold a belief of the fairy folk and lore of ancient Ireland. Before she passed away, my grandmother would have sat us down in her cottage and filled its walls with tales of all kinds of spirits, from silently watchful black hounds to the kelpie, a water horse that would seduce you into riding it before darting into the depths of a lake or loch and galloping into its murky depths. When my parents would collect us, Mum would scowl when she found out about the ghost story session, knowing that neither my brother nor I would be getting much sleep that night. Nevertheless, I cherish those fireplace memories, as they take me back to a simpler time when the dark winter evenings would be filled with life in the form of Granny's lilting, aged voice. My favorite of these creatures, or least favorite I suppose, given the endless amount of nightmares it implanted into my mind as a child, was the Banshee, a spirit tied to particular families. Legend has it that she appears in different forms, but tends to favor that of either a beautiful but distraught woman or of a hunched, ailing older washerwoman, if it appeared by sight at all. It is even more distinct, you see, by its unearthly cry. Its wails and weeps would fill a room, or would be audible from miles away across the countryside. The person who crosses path with the Banshee or its cry should quickly alert the family, as this is a signal that someone from the family has died or is set to die. Yes, the Banshee is an omen of death. As I grew older, I became cynical to the tales my grandmother had spouted, including that of the Banshee. I moved to the city for university at 18, and in immersing myself with life in the modern world, the ways of country life seemed to evaporate. A small-scale reflection of the increasingly modernizing world, I guess. Sad when you think about it, isn't it? That was until one particular summer. My parents had recently downsized to a small cottage deep in the barren Irish West, where the roar of city life was inaudible. I stayed with my parents for the month of July and spent long, languid days roaming the nearby fields and looking out for signs of wildlife, such as the foxes that roamed late at dusk, or the bats that flew low along the lanes, which were laden with sprawling plant life. My story begins, I suppose, in the second week of my stay. I had taken to going for twilight walks, making the most of our northern sun, which can see daylight, lasting until close to 11 p.m. I was some miles away from the house, but could sense darkness approaching and decided to make my way home. Nighttime in that part of the country is utterly dark and not something you want to find yourself swallowed by. It was as I was walking back that I heard it, the most startling, biting cry. It seemed to fill the world around me, as though echoing against stone walls, even though I was surrounded by open nature. I can try to describe it by saying that it was on one hand the sound of a woman in sharp pain, but equally that of a grieving mother, sobbing at the loss of her child. I was momentarily horrified. In one moment it seemed that all of my cynicism was laid to rest, and that I should run home without question. What sort of horrific creature was capable of producing a sound like this? However, I then tried to apply logic. After all, can't foxes make the most spine-tingling noises when they're distressed, or even in heat? There had to be a purely natural explanation to this, in spite of how indisputably unnatural it sounded. Whatever it was, I didn't want to stick around to find out. I would run home, I decided, and alert my parents, just in case someone was genuinely in distress or harm. I began to pick up my pace, breaking into a jog, but something in the peripheries of my vision brought me to a sharp and sudden stop. To my left was bogland, an area that I had been warned never to walk in, as it would be all too easy to sink into the wet ground and become stuck, or even suffocated. It was shocking to me, therefore, that in the midst of this bogland stood a woman, long, silvery blonde hair twisting in the evening breeze. The relative distance and encroaching darkness made it hard to make her out entirely, but she looked to be in her early to mid-20s, my age, and her face was contorted in what looked like either pain or horror. It was from her mouth, I realized, that the bone-chilling screams were emerging. Initially, I was stunned. This was so adverse to anything I'd experienced in this part of the world so far, which seemed so devoid of alarm or drama or consequence. But I shook myself then, and called out to the woman as loudly as I could. "Hello? What's wrong? Are you stuck?" She seemed to register me, small eyes turning in my direction, but there was no response, aside from the continuous screech, which now pounded in my head. "Hello? I'm going to try and get help. I'll be back as soon as I can." With that, I ripped my eyes from the woman and darted back to the house as quickly as I could. I was around a mile away, but phone signal was limited in that part of the country, and I knew I'd need to get home in order to do something to assist the woman. It would have been a risk to my own life to have walked across the bogland towards her. When I got home, my parents' warm faces quickly dropped to looks of alarm upon registering me. "What is it? You look as if you've seen a ghost." I quickly filled them in on what I'd seen, and they sprung into action, grabbing the phone and alerting the local Garda, our police force. In the meantime, my father and I leapt into the car to make our way back to the spot while my mother waited for the Garda to arrive. By car, we were there within minutes, and I quickly directed my father to where I had seen the incident. I pride myself on my sense of direction, and the lane is fairly straightforward, so I was utterly bemused when I realized that there was no woman in sight, nor sound within earshot bar the standard noises of a country evening. We scanned the area, but still, nothing. When my mother arrived with the constable, he questioned me about where I had seen the woman, and raised his eyebrow when I said that she was no longer there.
There's no way she could have been submerged in that space of time. You said she was standing fully upright when you saw her, right?
That's right. She was a bit of a distance away, but it didn't look like her legs were submerged at all. It was the screaming that made me run for help. He nodded.
Okay, son, thank you. Could you very clearly tell me once again exactly what you saw? Try not to miss anything out.
I did so, relaying the story to him again and trying to interpret his facial reactions as I did so. He remained quite neutral, writing my account into his notepad. When I finished, he paused before speaking slowly.
Right. I'm going to say first off that, given how few people live around here, I myself can't say that I know anyone fitting that description. I like to think I know each and everyone around these parts. However, I'm going to file a report and investigate this further. It might be that she got herself free and walked off again.
Here he stopped and bit the end of his pen, looking thoughtful, before continuing with some visible discomfort.
I want to thank you for alerting me about this. I just want to say though, before I set off, I've heard of cases like this in the past. Figures, women, appearing around the countryside and alarming a passerby with their cry. Well again, officially, I'm going to handle this as I'd handle any other case. But I want you to do me a favor. Check in with your family this evening and see how they're doing. It might sound odd, but can you do that for me?
Dad looked perplexed at this and seemed like he was going to ask further questions, but Mum interjected, nodding. "Yes, officer. I think I understand you. We'll do that." With that, we drove home. The darkness of the land around us was impenetrable, aside from the light of the car's full beam. It was a moonless night. We didn't need to contact our family members that evening. Well, we got in contact, but what I mean to say is that they reached us first. My mother's brother-in-law had sent her a message when we'd been out. The message wasn't long. It simply read, "Hi Bridget, tried to contact you but no reply. Please call." When Mum got through, she was distraught to find out that her sister had passed away that evening. It had been a sudden medical event that nobody had predicted. Aunt Sarah had been living with her husband and family in the USA for years. We saw her biannually most years, but the death shook us up nonetheless. In the days that followed, we sprung into action, assisting with funeral arrangements in whatever way we could and booking flights to Boston. I didn't voice it to my parents, not wanting to upset them further, but I couldn't help but consider the incident with the woman in the bog and what the officer had said to us. My logical mind tried its best to protest, but my memory kept tiptoeing back to the stories my grandmother had told me years ago, though particularly those of the Banshee. Was it possible that this could have been the explanation? Was the woman in the field trying to alert me, to warn me about the impending death of my aunt? It took 2 years for me to bring this up to my mother. I was once again visiting home and we were drinking tea in the garden. It was yet another summer evening at twilight, and I was taken back to that night by the bog. I voiced my memories to Mum and asked her if she remembered what the constable had said. She gazed into her teacup, sighed and looked at me slowly. "Yes, son, I remember. Do you recall me telling him that I thought I might understand?" "Yes, Mum, I do." "Your dad was ready to question him. Well, this might sound crazy to you, but I did understand. You see, about 3 years before that, something similar had happened. I took an intake of breath, and she must have seen my eyes widen. Oh no, I didn't see a woman, if that's what you think. But I did hear a cry from within the walls of our old home on the evening your granny passed away, as though someone was screaming deep inside our house. Of course, the difference is that we were prepared that time. We knew it was only a matter of days or hours. But I did hear the cry. It terrified me at the time. It's part of the reason we sold up and moved to this cottage. I was dumbstruck. When I finally found my voice, I told her I hoped that she hadn't come to hate the new house too, following what I had seen 2 years before. "Oh no," she responded. "No, actually, I think it's helped me deal with the first occasion, believe it or not. You see, I think maybe it's not a bad thing. She was distressed, you say, when you saw her there. The woman in the bog, I mean. Well, perhaps she was just as sad as we were. Perhaps she's just part of the family. I do wonder if anyone has seen or heard her in the past. Your grandmother, well, you remember her stories. I used to grimace when I came home to you and your brother shuddering on her sofa. I still stand by that." She smiled wistfully at me as she said this, and I was transported back to the corner of the old sofa. But it could be that she knew there was some truth behind what she was saying. Perhaps your grandmother, my mother, had seen our sad friend too. With that, she finished her tea, lifted both cups from the table, and walked to the sink, leaving me filled with thoughts, nostalgia, and an overwhelming sense of closeness to my own family, culture, and land that I hadn't felt before.